Alrighty guys, a very warm welcome to another video. So today we're going to be having a look at Sam Laidlow's bike position from Kona 2022, where he took almost 5 minutes or around about 5 minutes off the previous bike course record, going around 4 hours and 4 minutes. And he took the previous bike course record from Cameron Worth, who went around 4 hours and 9 minutes a few years prior. Now, this is in no way, and I think this is a very interesting discussion when we think about bike positions and we think about time trial positions, because in no way does one position equal or equate to the best being the best position for another bike rider. However, so it is very individual. However, also one rider's bike position, even if they're a professional, doesn't mean that it's necessarily 100% the fastest or most economical or most ideal bike position, even for them. And I know that Sam didn't do a whole lot of aero testing, if any, prior to Kona. He made some changes, pretty close to the race as well, regarding frame size, regarding his actual aero bar extension setup. And what's unique about Sam's setup relative to other riders, which you'll notice, is that his actual bars where his elbows sit, or his elbow pads, I should say, are actually directly mounted onto the extensions themselves rather than onto the actual bar itself. So that's something that's unique there. And you will notice that Sam does have quite an extended position where his elbows are quite a ways forward in front of his shoulders, which normally for a lot of athletes, if they are to extend their elbows too far out in front of their shoulders, you'd say they're kind of overextending, but Sam certainly has a very long torso. So this is why, this position works for him. But there are some key things to take away from this just regarding his position, not so much the bike or the equipment per se, but the actual position and what we can take away from that as age group athletes looking to optimize aerodynamics and also looking to optimize our run off the bike and our overall race performance. So the first thing you'll notice, of course, is that his hands and his helmet or his head are really close in terms of that horizontal line from the top of the hands to the eyes. He's basically just looking over the top of his thumbs there on the aero bars and is really close to the position at the front of the bike, which I think is one of the fastest ways that you can improve aerodynamics, is closing that frontal position. Now, where athletes get into a trap is that they'll have their bars slammed down super low, or they'll have them either or. So either too low, whereby the tops of their hands are quite low relative to their actual head position. And when they're riding on the road, they'll have this big kind of frontal surface. Whereas if you can close that down, of course, that's going to optimize the efficiency of the wind and minimize, or the wind around you, and minimize that drag as you're going along. Another thing as well, where some riders get into trouble with having their actual bars or elbow pads too low, is that obviously you're opening up this gap here, but you can also have too much of a bend in the spine if your physiology or biomechanics don't allow for a relatively straight spine, particularly when you look at the saddle height. So an interesting thing with the pros, and this is a common misconception, is that the best way to get aero or the best way to improve aerodynamics is to absolutely just slam the stem. That's the common phrase. And what that means is just put your bars down as low as they can possibly go, take all the spaces out, and then just ride it having that really low front end. What you'll notice is that if you draw a horizontal line from most of the professional athlete setups, from their actual elbow pads to their bike seat or their saddle and where they're sitting on the bike, it's really not that much of a drop from the saddle to the elbow pads themselves. Why this is important is for a few reasons. Number one, you're not overarching the spine and being too low in the front, which causes obviously more pressure on the shoulders and this to actually just stabilize yourself in that position, but it also puts more pressure on the lower back and those erector spinae muscles to hold the position over the course of 90 kilometers or 180 kilometers or a longer bike ride. So having a pretty, not too much of an aggressive drop from the actual saddle to the elbow pads themselves is very important, because you're taking a lot of the pressure off the spine. What it also does, and I know that Sam's unique in that he has this long torso, but being too low in the front closes the hip angle. So if you look at the angle from his actual torso, so where the suit's white and where it becomes black at his hips into his thighs, he really is able to open up this hip angle. And that's super important for any cyclist, really, because if you close this hip angle too much, what you're doing is, one, kind of constricting or restricting the movement at the hips and closing off that angle. So you're putting a lot more pressure on the actual hip flexor muscles themselves and tightening them up, which is going to be bad for the run. But you're also disengaging some of those bigger muscles, for example, the glutes, that do produce a lot of power and are a lot more efficient at producing power because they are those bigger muscle groups. And in the long run, you're going to lose power. So opening up this hip angle and almost being able to rotate the pelvis on the saddle itself, if that's a possibility, which it looks like Sam's doing, is very important for overall comfort, overall power output over the course of a long triathlon, and then also not restricting movement in the hip flexors, whereby you're going to get off the bike and take 1 or 2 kilometers just to open up and get movement back in those hip flexors, stretch them out again in order to get into a proper run stride. So there's some really key takeaways here, and I think it's going to summarize as 3 main points. 1, not having too much of a drop from your seat to your elbow pads, which allows a straighter back. It also allows you to, with less difficulty, close the gap between the head and the actual hands to improve the efficiency of, or reduce drag of the wind. And also it allows you to open up this hip angle as well. And that's going to improve power. It's also going to reduce the, like we said, restriction of those hip flexor muscles. So very, very important things. And particularly, I guess, like another point is with the arch in the back, you want to have as straight a back as possible, because if you are arching the back and then having the head down too low just to try and close that gap between the hands and the head, you're going to be catching, and I'll actually do another video on this next, that Chris Froome recently uploaded, with the fact that he actually went up in his frontal position, and that will allow improvements in aerodynamics. It will also allow him to open up that hip angle as well. So the reason why that was for Chris was because he has such good flexibility in the front end. When he was so low, his head was able to get down so low, but then it actually exposed the back of the, or the front, the top of the back, I should say, to the wind. So even though his head was out of the wind, his top of the back was actually catching a lot of wind, and so coming up allowed him to straighten the back and have a more in-line position with his head and his back, so that the wind's really just flowing over nicely and there's no catching points. You'll notice as well that with Sam's position, even though he's kind of nearing the bottom of his pedal stroke here, he's not overextending or pointing the toes too far down. That's a sign of having the seat up too high if your toes are pointing too far down. And what that's going to do is, 1, not allow you to engage those strong muscles in the glutes if your seat's up too high. It's also going to not allow you to rotate on the saddle, rotate your actual hips on the saddle to open up that hip angle as well. So it's going to really constrict or, limit movement throughout the hips and that angle throughout the hips. So really important points is, don't be afraid of having your bars up a little higher, because that's not necessarily going to detriment your aerodynamics. If anything, that higher bar position can actually improve aerodynamics and improve comfort. And 2, having the seat, if you had a choice of having a seat too low or too high, and I'm not talking multiple centimeters, I'm just talking within a few millimeters or even a centimeter each way, any day of the week you'd take it as having it a centimeter too low than a centimeter too high, because being lower will open up the hip angle compared to being higher, and it will also allow more engagement of those bigger muscle groups where you're otherwise going to be inactivating them or limiting their engagement if you're otherwise just reaching for the pedals. And a key telltale sign of that is by having the toes pointed too far down. Another thing, and lastly, what we'll finish on is the crank length. Now, you don't obviously want to be playing around with buying new cranks just to try it if you otherwise can't afford to do so. But one of the common movements, especially in the pro field, is to move to a shorter length crank. So say, for example, standards like 172.5 or 170 mil cranks. A lot of the pros will run, for example, 165 millimeter cranks, because having a shorter crank length also is going to enable you to open up the hip angle and get better rotation through the pelvis, because you're not having to reach as far for the pedal. But even if you're optimized at the bottom of the pedal stroke, you're not having to come up as far at the very top end of the pedal stroke, which is going to, again, really restrict movement in that hip angle and really put more pressure on those hip flexor muscles. So having shorter length cranks will allow you to have a more open hip position or more open hip angle throughout the entire course of the actual pedal stroke, which will, in theory, help to improve efficiency. Where this kind of falls apart a little bit with shorter cranks is if you're in a really hilly course or on a very hilly course, whereby having more crank length allows you to get more torque through your pedal stroke and produce more power through torque on the uphills, which is more important when you're climbing than when you're otherwise on the flat. So a flatter, more flowing course, you can probably get away with shorter crank lengths generally. A hilly course where you have actual climbs, it might be a little bit of a net positive to net negative kind of trade-off equation, whereby are you losing torque and losing power on the climbs versus are you gaining efficiency on the downhills and flats by allowing yourself to not come up as high during the pedal stroke and therefore open up the hip movement, or open up the hip angle, I should say. So overall, very it appears like a well-dialed position. Obviously, it led him to the bike course record at Kona, so you can't criticize it all that much. And I think what we can take away from it are some really key points of focus, which every athlete should be, or a lot of Ironman athletes should be looking at, because we know that speed is a combination of aerodynamics, comfort, and power. And you can optimize aerodynamics to the, absolute maximum capacity. But if you're otherwise compromising comfort and power, that's one, going to negatively affect your bike split. It's also going to compromise your run a lot. So combination of the two and allowing for an open or a more open hip angle is going to help the run, certainly in the early stages where you're not going to be as tight, and then also in the later stages where cramping and all that kind of stuff comes into play. So obviously there's more to take away from this, but I think they're the key things. Don't get too aggressive on the aero position. Focus on closing the angle of the hands to the head, flattening at the back if it's possible, but not overreaching in the extensions. And then if you can, find a very comfortable saddle where you can rotate the hips and actually open that angle up organically, or at the very least, bringing the bars up a little bit to open up the hips, because that's going to allow better power generation and a more, primed body and hip mobility for when you actually do get onto the run itself. So hopefully that was some information, or help. It was some information. Hopefully that was some helpful information for you guys. And let me know if you have any questions below. Obviously, there's a lot more, like I said, but there's some of the key takeaways from this. So take care, guys. Happy training. And a key reason as well is the best time to be doing all this stuff and having a play around with it is during the off season, when you don't have any big races coming up in the next 4, 5, 6 to 10 weeks. So this is the time of the year, if you don't have any races for a few months, where you could play around with some of this stuff. You don't want to be doing anything in the week or weeks before the race itself. So take care, guys. Happy training over the new year, and I will see everyone in the next video.